So you're looking to save time in the gym, but you haven't taken the high intensity approach just yet. But overall, you're sick of these long drawn out volume workouts taking 2 hours out of your day to get lackluster results. Or you're doing high intensity, but at the end of your workouts or at the end of your sets, you feel like there's something left in the tank. There's gains left on the table. Either way, drop sets are for you. Let me explain. So let's say you're in column A and you're doing high volume training and you're spending 2 hours in the gym doing reps in reserve with a bunch of rest in between your sets, and you're bored out of your skull because you're doing 2 hour long workouts you could realistically be cramming into about 30 minutes with drop sets. For example, if you do a tricep extension, right, and you do 3 sets of 10 reps with 2 minutes of rest in between, you are looking at about 10 to 15 minutes for that exercise to complete it. Whereas if you then get to take that same 3 sets of 10 reps and cram it into a drop set, you're looking at about 2 to 3 minutes per exercise. So you would get that first set, take it to failure, 10 reps, total failure, drop about 10 kilos, immediately repeat the same process, 8 to 10 reps, do it one more time to failure, and bam, you've done 3 sets of 10 reps, all taken to failure with a superior pump because there's no rest in between. You're more focused because there's no rest in between. And you're taking all the sets to failure, saving a shit ton of time in the process. Now, let's say you're in column B and you're doing high intensity and you're saving the time and you're getting better gains. Congrats, you're now on the side of exercise science logic. However, that isn't to say that you can't then get some benefit from drop sets. The first example would be a muscle that you feel like you have poor mind-muscle connection on. Let's say, for example, it's your lats. The lats are a common muscle that has bad mind-muscle connection, especially with beginners, but even advanced lifters such as myself still have poor mind-muscle connection because there's less proprioception in it and it's posterior, and there's less pain receptors. So in this case, you might need to do a bit more work beyond failure in order to recruit every motor neuron and every muscle fiber. So if you're doing pull-ups, for example, you might need to do a weighted pull-up and then drop to body weight and then do a band assisted pull-up in order to get the back fully work. It could also be a smaller muscle group such as side laterals or rear delts where it's a low impact movement and your central nervous system and muscles recover quite a bit quicker. Thus you can get away with a bit more muscle damage and thus you can do more drop sets. Whereas with say a compound movement like a squat or a deadlift, you might not even want to go to failure, let alone beyond failure, because in a squat, if you train to failure, you're going to be stuck at the bottom with a bar on your back. Or if it's a deadlift, your lower back is going to fail before your hamstrings or glutes do. Thus, you'll be breaking down form, and it's better not to take to absolute mechanical failure, especially if you're a novice. You might also just find that you're psychologically more assured at the end of your workout if you do a few more reps beyond failure with drop sets. Even if a straight set to failure is sufficient, if your mentality isn't there, I think you might be lacking a little bit. It might not be the case that from an esoteric point of view that when you don't have your mindset there, you manifest less gains. More in the logical realm that because your mentality isn't there, you're lacking everywhere else because you don't have the mental motivation or the correct path to go on because you don't believe in what you're doing. So I'm a huge firm believer in believing in what you're doing is correct. Some of the best athletes of all time will often say part of their success, or a very large part of their success, was simply that they believed in themselves massively. They trusted the process. Then lastly, you might be in the same boat as me where you don't have a workout partner and you don't have the luxury of force reps from the workout partner assisting the weight when you've hit failure. Or you're not doing a unilateral movement where you can use your free arm to assist the weight up. Now, in saying all this, do we need to drop set everything? No, there are plenty of movements where you will have sufficient tension and stimulus from just a straight set to failure. Or you might have a movement where you can help yourself out with a unilateral movement, you can do force reps. Or it might be a movement like a dip where you can jump up and do force negatives, etc. So you don't always have to do drop sets. You might also just have a movement where you don't need any extra stimulus beyond failure. For me, for example, a decline bicep curl, I don't need any drop sets, force reps, or rest pauses because the stimulus from that movement alone is sufficient enough to get the job done. Because the arms have so many more pain receptors, so much more proprioception, and that exercise is so tailored to hypertrophy with a massive contraction at the top and huge stretch at the bottom, I don't need any extra stimulus to get the job done. There are also many examples of people in the past who just did straight sets to failure. First example of this would be Mike Mentzer, who later in his career believed that you didn't need any work beyond failure, and in fact, it would hinder you. That was Mike Mentz's belief, and he trained over 10,000 clients in his lifetime. And then for a great natural example, Jay Vincent became a fitness model naturally with just straight sets to failure with high intensity. So there may be no real reason to do anything beyond failure. Although then you also have Dorian Yates, who was notorious for doing drop sets and forced reps and rest pauses after his main set to failure. So there's a bit of, it's up for debate, and the science isn't quite there yet. Personally, I believe in overkill than underkill. Thus, I like to go a bit beyond failure if I feel like it is needed. So at the end of the day, much like anyone in their training journey, you have to be your own science experiment. You have to try out what gives you the best pump, what gives you the best mind-muscle connection, what gives you the best progressive overload, what gives you the most DOMs the next day, all these different things that can take into account to figure out whether or not a movement is sufficient or not, or the amount of time under tension is sufficient or not. Everyone's different. For me, I need drop sets on my back. Other people will need drop sets on their legs. For other people, it might be their abs. It could be any muscle, and it could just be entirely dependent on your individual needs. I would also add that force reps are typically superior to drop sets in most scenarios, as they are more efficient and they're more time efficient, and you're going beyond failure immediately after failing rather than having to rest, say, 5-10 seconds while you dick around changing the plates or the pin stack. So at any time, if you can opt in for a forced rep, I would take that option. Unless it is a movement that is a little bit more personal, like a side lateral raise, where you don't want a dude standing directly behind you, helping you raise your arms up like Dirty Dancing or something. And then for another side note, I would say sometimes rest pauses might also be preferred, although that's a video for a different day on rest pauses. Now, how do we optimize drop sets? Well, you first need to analyze the movement. For example, if you're doing a light movement like a side lateral raise, you could easily drop like 2 or 5 kilos and then immediately go into another set and get 6 to 10 reps because it's quite a light movement. However, if you go to the other side of the spectrum with a compound movement like a bench press, if you're bench pressing 100 kilos and you only drop off 5 kilos and immediately go into another set, you're not going to get a single rep because it's so much heavier, you're so much stronger. You need to drop at least 30 or 40 kilos depending on how strong you are. If you're benching 180, you might need to drop 50 kilos or whatever it might be. But if it's a compound movement, you need to make a bigger drop in order to get those, optimal 3 to 4 plus reps on that drop set. And then an in-between movement would be, say, a tricep extension where you're not necessarily powerful, but you're not necessarily weak. So you might be dropping more like 10 kilos rather than 5 or 20 or 30 like the bench press. And then secondly, you have to analyze, is it a plate loaded movement or is it a pin loaded movement? Because if it's a barbell bench press, you're going to need to use plates. And if you're using plates, you need to set up smaller, more numerous plates in order to be able to easily, accessibly take them off and then get back onto the bench. Because if you're taking too much time dicking around, putting big plates on and off, you're going to spend too much time resting in between the drop sets. And the whole idea of the drop set is to immediately get into it after you have failed the initial set. Otherwise, you're better off just doing a rest pause at that point. Another option for drop sets is a variation drop set, which I prefer, if you can do this, to do this over the weight drop because it is quicker and more efficient and can give you a better mind-muscle connection. So for example, let's say you were doing a tricep extension and you're doing an underhand variation first. That's the weaker variation because overhand is you're typically stronger. You would start with underhand, and then once you fail the underhand, you would immediately go hands over and bang out another 6 to 10 reps because you're twice as strong on the overhand. This way you don't have to then stop lifting, go to the pin stack, take plates out and resume. You can just immediately drop set by changing the grip. I think this is far more effective, especially in a movement, say like the pec fly or a dumbbell pec fly, where you can start with the isolation movement and then finish with a dumbbell pec press, which you're stronger in. And this way, if you have, say, tricep or front delt dominance, you will be isolating the chest first, it'll be pre-exhausted, and then when you fail the pec fly, you can immediately go into a dumbbell press, of which you're twice as strong on, but because you've pre-exhausted, now all of a sudden, half the weight feels doubly as heavy. So there's many ways you can do this, and I think it can be far more effective than actually having to drop the weight, especially if you're doing like a barbell movement where you could realistically be spending 20 seconds stripping plates if you don't have a workout partner. And if you have a workout partner, well, you're better off just doing force reps anyway. And then lastly, we need to figure out how many drop sets do we need for a given exercise. So this will depend on the movement itself, like many of the other points in this video. If you're doing, say, a pull-up where your mind muscle connection is poor, you might need 3 or 4 drop sets to really get the adequate stimulus to grow. Or say you're doing a bicep curl where your mind muscle connection is really good, you might only need a single drop set to get the job done. So again, it depends on you. You need to experiment and see how many drop sets are adequate. And again, if you want to just go by the overkill principle, you could just do a shit ton of drop sets for everything and make sure that you totally annihilate the muscle. Although if you're doing drop sets on every single movement, you might find that you will overtrain. So again, you have to sort of be your own science experiment with these different things, depending on whether you're cutting, you're bulking, your age, your testosterone levels, the muscle at hand. If you do 4 or 5 drop sets on a squat, you're going to overtrain. That's too much stimulus for your central nervous system. You don't even need that much muscle damage. So if you haven't already implemented drop sets into your training, I'd highly suggest giving them a go, at the very least to simply save time, but also to get better gains. I would invite you to find a muscle that you haven't seen gains or adequate gains in the last 6 months on, and try some drop sets for 6 months. Because again, if you haven't seen gains in 6 months, a year, sometimes you guys haven't seen gains in 2-3 years, why would you continue doing the same old shit that's not giving you any results? So if you haven't seen gains in the last 6 months on a certain muscle group, maybe switch to high intensity on that muscle group and keep the volume there with drop sets. Because I get it, a lot of us are brainwashed to think more is better. So if you're still under that false pretense that you need volume to grow, well, take the same volume you've been doing, but cram it into a shorter time period with drop sets and see the gains come. If you haven't seen gains in 6 months, you're not going to see gains in the next 6 months doing the same old shit. And if you have any more questions about drop sets, or you feel like I've left anything out, comment below. I'd be happy to extrapolate further on drop sets. And until next time, subscribe, like, all that shit. See you cunts later.